During this period of Easter, the 5 Sundays of Easter, in this particular cycle of a 3-year lectionary that we follow in preaching usually, every New Testament reading is taken from the book of Revelation, albeit what is chosen are little snippets, little tidbits, which are probably fairly easy to understand. But for most people, the book of Revelation is a closed book, and if you actually start reading it through, and I don't know how many of you have, if ever, read it right the way through, you'll come across some fairly surprising and different statements and quite difficult bits to understand. The book begins with a fairly standard greeting used in letters, but if you go on and look at the rest of the book, you'll find all sorts of things that are really quite difficult and to get your head around. We largely it's because we don't understand the symbolic language and the metaphorical images and literary allusions the author uses to convey the content of his vision. And for that reason, it's very rarely preached on. However, if we preachers don't give our congregations the keys that will help them to unlock the message of Revelation, then what happens is that people get hold of the book and interpret it in all sorts of mad and curious ways, making out of it what was never meant to be there in the first place. Of course, it has also spawned an incredible amount of literature, films and the like that have been quite fanciful and built on a quite mistaken understanding of what it's all about. And so it's very important for us to consider this, and for me, therefore, to introduce it to you, because otherwise people will be misled. Now, it was written about AD 95. The earliest record we have any witness to that date is Bishop Irenaeus in around AD 180, which is quite a long time afterwards. However, scholars, having found clues in the text, which I won't go into because it will take too long, have concluded that it was most likely to have been written during the reign of Domitian, one of the Roman emperors, and he was one of the emperors who started to persecute the church, although not nearly so severely as did Nero, an earlier emperor, to which the book of Revelation also alludes, by the way. We don't actually know who John the author was. Most people have assumed him to be the Apostle John. However, lots of other reasons, which I won't go into, for lots of other reasons, it's highly unlikely to have been the author of John's Gospel. And it's very likely that it could have been somebody who just used the John, or the Apostle John's name, as a pseudonym, because there are lots of other apocalyptic books that have started to circulate around about that time that use authors or the author of which actually used pseudonyms, and it was a quite common practice to attribute a book to some famous or well-known person, a way of sort of increasing its validity, if you like, or credibility, I should say. But be that as it may, when you actually read it in its original language, the Greek is very poor. So it's quite likely, therefore, that it was written by somebody whose first language was Aramaic, coming from Palestine, probably Syria, who had moved to Ephesus and where he was undoubtedly based. Now, it could be the fact that when you're writing a vision, I don't know if you've ever tried writing your dreams down. Well, you know, some people do, and you're trying to write the dream down, you've got to write it pretty fast, because if you're not particularly careful, you'll lose the dream, and then of course your grammar will go out the window too. You just write what you get down as quickly as possible. Well, that may be another explanation for his poor Greek, I don't know. But what's the purpose of this book, and how come it found its way into the Bible at all? There was quite a lot of debate about it before it actually was finally accepted in the canon of Scripture. And is it any use for us today? And if so, how can we interpret its message? First, it has the characteristics of what has been called apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature arises when prophetic literature and prophetic messages have run their course. The Old Testament prophets were speaking into the present, and they had a vision of the future, but they were addressing the political and spiritual situation in which they lived. They were delivering what they believed to be God's message for the people amongst whom they lived, and to the political and spiritual leaders of the day. And there was hope that somehow within the near future something would change, that people and the leaders would have a change of mind, would repent. But when nothing changes, when it seems as if there's no hope of change, then you start writing apocalyptic literature, or at least it starts appearing, and that's what happened. That's why Daniel got into the Old Testament when there was no sign of any change. And similarly, of course, we are in a period of history today when it looks as though there's going to be no change. So what apocalyptic literature does, it projects the denouement, the resolution of the problems, either out into the future or into some kind of intervention from outside of history. So God's got to intervene, and if God doesn't do it, then how are we going to get this mess sorted out? But if you look beneath the surface of the book, and particularly the book of Revelation, and understand its message, you will find it is also a politically subversive document, because it challenges world domination systems, and therefore it is written so that only insiders with the necessary background in the Old Testament scriptures could really understand the message. Hence it wasn't destroyed, by the way, and its use of symbols and images, which of course largely are drawn from the Old Testament, was familiar to the original readers. But how are we to access it for ourselves today, and how can we benefit from its message by studying it today? Well, perhaps we might start looking at what the editor of the book says about it in his introduction, or whoever wrote the introduction is reckoned to be somebody else other than the person that wrote the rest of his vision down. Well, there are some hints that are found in the way that he describes the book in the first few verses. And in that we discover that it's a revelation. Usually it is the word apocalypse, actually in Greek, and it means a revelation. But what do we mean by that? Well, it helps us to see into the spiritual dimension that lies behind and beneath the structures, the physical structures and the historical events of human history. And there's a basic understanding that reality isn't just what we see on the surface, in that what we perceive as, which is what we perceive as solid matter or reality, but there's a deeper dimension, just as real, another dimension to reality, the spiritual dimension. So apocalyptic literature and revelations is the word apocalypse, takes us beneath the physical and reveals the spiritual dimension that lies behind, within, around what is the physical dimension. And it's very difficult to speak about spiritual dimension of reality. So the vision depicts that reality in picture language. It's a kind of cartoon, except that it isn't just a visual cartoon, it's an acoustic cartoon. It's what you hear that matters, that interprets what you see. So, for example, you hear the roaring of a lion, and what you see is the lamb, a blood-stained lamb, stained with his own blood. That's in the vision of chapter 4. So it uses symbolic language, and as I said, largely drawn from the Old Testament. So that you'll get references to the plagues of Egypt, in Exodus, to Jezebel, to Babylon, for example. All of these, which lie in the past, become symbols that are used in the visions to depict what is actually there in the present. And this Hebrew imagery is creating an impression to the ear rather than to the eye. So if you read through the book of Revelation, you try to sort of paint the picture in your eye, or you get actually into some sort of confusion. So we try and make sense of them, but we don't actually get it because we're actually in the 21st century. But back then, the first readers would have got it because they were much more attuned to the kind of language it was using and attuned to the way of talking, which is the sort of what I call an acoustic cartoon. A cartoon that relies on the emotions, the emotive feelings that these words evoke. And so what we have to do then is to listen to the symphony of the book as a whole, rather than to dissect the music into notes. Many symphonies have found four movements. Have four movements. The book of Revelation actually has 8, which we'll come to in a minute. So we have to read the book as a whole to get the message, and to listen to the music it sounds through these cartoon images that that, well, we should listen to it. And so all music, of course, all good symphonic music does, it elicits emotions within us, emotions which actually cannot be easily put into words either. And of course, there are also symbolic numbers, and we mustn't be confused by them. The number 7, symbolizing completion, repeatedly occurs, as you'll discover, and is the structure the whole is built on, the significance of the number 7, replicating the 7 days of creation, by the way. And then there's 144,000 that are said to be sealed. For example, the 12 is the number of the tribes, and 1,000 is a military formation. A squared number expresses perfection. 12 times 12 thousands, therefore, means as the sealed number are the totality of those who are baptized into Jesus' name and were part of God's Israel. But remember the significance of hearing the number. It expresses something about the inner essence of God's people. It is an all-inclusive number. Well, then later the same group is called the Great Multitude from all nations of the world. There are other numbers like 1,260 days or 3.5 years. It's also the same and equivalent as 42 months, and all are used in another symbolic number for a period of time, which you'll find later in the book, as is the number of 1,000 years for the millennium. So anyway, finally, we have, as I said, to understand that heaven and earth are co-relative realities. That is, that there are two realities, two ways of talking about the same thing. Heaven and earth. There's a heavenly dimension and there's an earthly dimension. Of course, that is right from the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, which talks of God creating both the heavens and the earth, the heaven being the spiritual dimension, the earth being the physical dimension of reality. Now, secondly, it is spoken of as a prophecy. Now, obviously, prophecy has a future orientation, but its aim is to challenge us in the present and to help us to cope with the present. So it uses past events to speak of the present and the future. And therefore, Book of Revelation uses symbols drawn from the Old Testament past in order to talk about the present. But what we have to understand when we read through the Book of Revelation is that the order is logical, but it is certainly not chronological. So many people have got into problems because they don't understand this very basic point. And the basic perspective is that through all the chaotic stuff that's going on around us, God is actually still in control. So at various points we get glimpses of the heavenly boardroom, the command center, if you like. So these occur during the various interludes between scenes. And the purpose of these glimpses is to reassure us that despite the chaos, God is moving things forward, or everything is moving forward purposefully towards the goal of perfection, or the fulfillment of what creation was supposed to be, a redemption of it indeed. And in one of them we're also shown what our mission is during these days. So the challenge, of course, is to live our lives now in the present in the light of God's future, so that we will have a part, we'll become stakeholders in that future. Finally, it describes the book of Revelation as a letter, and therefore it addresses the situation of the church in the present age. Well, obviously the present age when it was written way back then, but the 7 churches, although they have their particular circumstances which are alluded to in the way that the letters are written, nevertheless represent the kind of problems and challenges that the church faces throughout the ages. And the age that the book of Revelation deals with is called the last days. And that doesn't refer just to end times, which is often the way it's been taken, but is a technical term referring to the whole period between the first and second comings of Christ. And that is how they would have understood the word last days. They, of course, didn't know how long that would last. And it has stretched out for over 2,000 years or more. But when you consider the whole of the 14 billion year history of this earth, that we now understand to be the case, it is just a few seconds. Well, each scene, except for the last one, the eighth scene, actually covers the whole of that period. And its purpose, of course, is mainly pastoral, because what people have to do in every age is to overcome the obstacles that are put in their way because of the kind of world that we live in, the kind of society that we live in, which is often simply referred to as the world. We are to overcome the world, but that is to be understood as basically human society that is orientated away from God, that is not therefore working with, cooperating with God in any way. Patmos is the island where John was imprisoned for on account of his faith, and it's marked on the map here. And you will find that in his first part of the book of Revelation contains letters to 7 churches or 7 congregations, starting with Ephesus, which was the sort of, if you like, if it's a bit like the diocesan centre, a bit like Edinburgh, and the other towns around it, about it, were a bit like the congregations in the diocese of Edinburgh or wherever. And the order in which the letters appear in the book is actually the order in which a runner taking the letters to those different places would visit. So he starts off in Ephesus, the centre, goes from there to Smyrna, to Pergamum, Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and then finally to Laodicea in that order. The first scene opens with that vision of Christ central in his church. Now, this is the first of the glimpses we get into the heavens, and we see the cosmic Christ standing amongst the lampstands that represent the 7 congregations to which the letters are addressed. It's likely to be a menorah, the kind of lamp that was the original tabernacle. It was in the original tabernacle, sorry. Now, in the Gospel of John, it says that the Logos, the eternal Word, through whom God created the universe, became an enfleshed human being and dwelt among us. So the word used for dwell is actually literally the tabernacled pitched his tent among his people, if you like. So the historical person of Jesus was the fulfillment of the tabernacle of Moses, in which God dwelt among his people. Now these lampstands are in the heavenly tabernacle, in which the risen cosmic Christ is the chief high priest. And the congregations of believers are the churches that carry the light of Christ. And then you will find Christ is holding in his hand 7 stars, which are described as angels, and each letter is addressed to the angel of that church. And an angel is the messenger, the message part, the inner life of that congregation. The word angels, as I said, means messenger. So the message being the testimony that the congregation and the part that it is a witness, and therefore that provides the light of Christ in the community in which it's located. So what the risen Christ is doing is addressing each congregation to challenge them, no matter what their circumstances, to let their light shine. And so, of course, that is relevant for us in our time too. Before I give an overview of the whole of the book of Revelation, I'm going to say a little bit about the 7 letters, which is the first scene of Revelation. And in that you will find, I like to call it 7 steps to the throne, because ultimately what we are being called to do is to overcome the different challenges and to embody the virtues of that we are called to be as followers of Jesus Christ, to embody rather as people of faith. And then there are promises given to those who overcome the challenges, and that ends up with the promise of being given the privilege of being able to be enthroned with Christ. A promise that is actually spoken about more fully later in the book. I'm leaving you to think about what these virtues are, what the challenges are, what the promises are, the virtues to aim at. And only 2 of the churches, incidentally, are commended for these virtues. The rest fall far short of them and are criticised for falling short, and the challenge therefore is to overcome rather than give in to the world around them. So that's enough said about the seven letters, but I'm going to move on now to, well, let you fill those in when you come to study it, but I'm going to move on and talk about the structure of the book as a whole. The structure of the book of Revelation consists of many layers, and each of these layers is a different scene, and the sequence is shaped by what John saw next. You have that phrase, "and I saw," repeatedly. Rather than the time sequence, it is like a drama, exactly like a drama. And at the beginning, you get a wee prologue and a greeting, and then we start with the very first scene, which I've talked about already, the first glimpses into heaven with Christ, the risen Christ, standing in the midst of his churches, represented by the lampstand. And then he goes on to write these letters, the content of which I've already alluded to, but you can study the 7 ideals or virtues to aim at, the 7 challenges that the churches face, and the 7 promises to those who overcome. So the signal for the beginning of a new scene is the phrase, "I saw heaven opened." And as this is found at the beginning of the 2nd scene, the 4th and the 5th scene. And that leads to an interlude, which we find in chapter 4 and 5, when we are treated to a glimpse into the heavenly command room. This time, Christ is central, not amongst the church, but central in the cosmos. And encircled around him are the 24 elders, representing leaders of the 12 tribes of the Old Testament Israel and the 12 apostles of the New Testament church. The big question is, who is worthy to break open the 7 seals of a document that contains the suffering of humanity, past, present, and future? And once it is clear that only the one who has suffered with and in the world and for the world, the Lamb upon the throne, has the authority to break open the 7 seals, so then the sufferings can be revealed as the seals are broken. The first 4, represented symbolically by 4 horsemen, reveal that the church will suffer the consequences of war, famine, and natural disasters with the world. When the 5th seal is broken, the fact that the church will suffer as a result of being persecuted by the world is revealed. And when the 6th seal is broken, what is revealed is that the church will not escape the terrible suffering that the world as a whole will suffer as a consequence of humanity not fulfilling their God-given mandate to be stewards of God's creation. So then in chapter 7, there's an interlude, because the question that is left at the end of chapter 6, when the 6th seal is broken, is who is going to be able to remain standing? It's like an earthquake. Who's going to stand? And the answer is that the faithful will stand. They will not be destroyed by all of this. The church will stand. It's like when you get an earthquake, and supposing you've got a town that's flattened by the earthquake, but the one building that's standing is the church in the middle. Well, of course, it's not an actual building. We're talking about living people and the living church here. It is people who have not sworn allegiance to or gone the way and followed the way of the world. But anyway, then we get the 7th seal, broken, and we get silence. Silence in heaven for half an hour for the prayers. Well, what is your response to the suffering in the world? It should be silence and prayer. Groaning with the world. Not words, not lots of words, just silence and groans. And the Spirit knows how to intercede for us. And after the silence, we get the next scene opening, during which the 7 trumpets are blown. Now, in the Old Testament, one of the reasons that the trumpets were blown was to warn people of danger. The enemy is coming. Get inside the walls of safety, etc. So these trumpets are blown as warnings. And if you look at them, the first 4 replicate the plagues of Egypt, affecting the earth, the sea, the rivers, and the sky. Now, they're using these as symbolic images, so that there is a sense in which the warning is to the peoples, that's the inhabitants of the earth, to change their ways before it's too late. And if you look through those warnings, what we are finding today with the things that are happening in the world affecting our environment, there's climate change, there's wars, there's injustice, and all of the events that we're living through today, including, for example, the migrations that are happening increasingly because of the injustice, the unjust ways in which we've treated emerging nations in the South. They're actually warning signs. And then when the fifth trumpet is blown, there's a release of demonic powers, representing that the people of the world will suffer some spiritual consequences as well. Now, we can speculate about what those might be, which we'll leave that to the study itself. But a final warning note, the sixth trumpet represents the destruction of everything that humanity has sought to build by the worship of mammon, by the worship of material riches and wealth and consumerism, but still they don't repent. So the question at this stage is, how will they repent? And as in the previous scene, when the seventh trumpet is blown, there's an interlude. And during the interlude, we are given another glimpse into what is happening in the heavenly dimension. Now, the answer to the question as to how they may repent is that it will be through the faithful witness of God's people. So first, there is the commissioning of the witnesses. And then there is the testimony of the witnesses. That's chapter 10 and chapter 11. So the actual mission, if you like. And that is showing us what we are called to be and to do during these last days. And at the end of chapter 11, the seventh trumpet is blown. And the world, meaning the world domination systems, are no more. So in this interlude, there's not silence, there's worship in heaven. And then we get another scene opening from chapter 11, verse 19, when the final trumpet is blown. So the fourth scene reveals a spiritual dimension that lies beneath the drama that's taking place on the earth. It enables us to see the spiritual dimension of what is happening at a far greater depth. They describe 7 portents of cosmic conflict, using many Old Testament symbols to speak of these matters. But in chapter 13, there is a satanic perversion of government and a satanic perversion of religion. They are revealed using symbols based on the beasts in the visions recorded in the book of Daniel, which is the Old Testament apocalypse. So the second beast arising out of the earth represents false religion, doing signs and wonders in order to deceive even believers into following it. Now think about what that means today. We can see many things happening in the church today where Christians are being led totally astray, often because they have misunderstood the book of Revelation, by the way, or interpreted in a particular way. So when we're given the number of the beast in 13:18, 666, about which there has been so much speculation, however, this is not a puzzle for us to solve. If 7 is the number representing perfection, 6 is the number that symbolizes anything that falls short of perfection. It is simply the number symbolizing the imperfection of imperfections, which these beasts representing satanic perversions of both government and religion embody. Unfortunately, the church got into bed with the same structure of government when Constantine adopted Christianity, but it could happen to any religion. As with all the previous scenes, the sixth element leads into another interlude in heaven, during which we are treated to the wonderful sound of songs of praise on the lips of all who had not bowed down and worshipped the beast and all that it stood for. These beasts in Daniel are in contrast to the reign of the one who is described as the Son of Humanity, Daniel chapter 7. The beasts parody the genuine article, and the beasts represent the top-down type of government. But when Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world," he didn't mean it was just a heavenly or otherworldly kingdom. He meant it was an upside-down kind of kingdom that empowered the weak and the vulnerable to be able to stand against the structures of governments that favor the rich and the powerful in this world. So, it is not surprising then at this juncture, in the heavenly dimension of reality that is happening in eternity time, we see a vision of the Son of Humanity, the one representing the fully integrated human being, a fully developed, fully evolved human being who is completely at one with God, appearing and holding in his hand a sickle that he will use to reap the harvest of humanity. This is the seventh sign and ushers in, or the seventh portent, I should say, and ushers in the next scene. The fifth scene is all about just deserts. In other words, the world doesn't mend its ways, change its ways, then they will suffer the consequences of their ways. The bowls of God's wrath should be understood in terms of consequences rather than beatings by God in any way. So it's exactly the same sequence as when the seven trumpets are blown. Exactly the same things happen, but this time at a greater intensity. So we're back with the plagues of Egypt again. And then we get 1, 2, 3, 4. There's an intensification at 5, and then 6, the final one. But there's no interlude between the 6th and 7th scene. So the transcendent character of the 7th scene of each component is also seen, by the way, in the 7th scene of the book as a whole, which I'll come to in a minute. So we move straight on to the 6th scene, the fall of Babylon, the harlot, representing world domination systems. The 7 words of justice give us 7 reasons why the world domination systems must be judged. And I won't go into the details of those either at this point. Nor is there an interlude between the 7th and final scene of world history. Between the 6th and the final scene, which is the 7th scene. So I've entitled this The Drama Behind History, 7 Visions of Reality. So the saving judge arrives, we are assured that his victory is sure, the agents of deception are removed, the deceiver is bound and then removed, and the witnesses are vindicated. So there's no more deception. So I'm going to leave any comment on this scene again until we get round to studying it, as there are some controversial opinions as to how to interpret what is said. And then we are treated to a preview of the final scene in chapter 21, verses 1 to 8. So the final scene, parts of which are often read at funerals, is a vision of a new heaven and a new earth. It's about a new creation. So there are 7 final revelations that take us beyond the 7 days of creation. We're talking now about the 8th day, or a completely new creation in another new 7 days, as it were. Except he doesn't talk about 7 days. It talks about the 7 revelations of the new creation. So the book of Revelation that's the whole book of Revelation in a nutshell. I hope you'll find it a helpful guide to our study of this very, very important and relevant book. Thank you. One final thing to say, and that is to notice the pattern of the things that happen in each scene. You get 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th element of each scene is represents an intensification of what has gone before, or sort of at a deeper level, if you like. And then the 7th element always is a transcendent element of each scene, and then often leads into the interlude and the same goes for the 5 scenes. So the 5th scene is an intensification of everything, and that's the just deserts and the 7th bowl of God's wrath. So that's an intensification of what had gone before with the trumpets. And then you've got the 7th scene, which is the drama behind history, and that is actually something that is in the transcendent realm, if you like, the realm beyond the physical, in the spiritual dimension.